Good morning and welcome to our opening panel today. I will briefly introduce Dr. M. Norman, who is the editor-in-chief of our World Affairs Journal, published on behalf of the Policy Studies Organization by Sage Publishing. Sage has made a number of articles related to the Middle East open access for a limited time. And I am adding the link in the chat if you are interested to visit and read those articles, including one article by our speaker today, Professor Alon Ben-Meir, on making the case for an Israeli Jordanian Palestinian Confederation. So I encourage you all to go and read those articles. They are open access for a limited time. So I leave the floor now to Dr. M. Norman.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Dr. Gutierrez. My name is Dr. Emma Norman, and I'm currently the editor-in-chief, as Daniel said, of World Affairs Journal, the oldest current affairs journal in the United States. And today I'm speaking to you from sunny Cornwall in the United Kingdom. It's my privilege and my pleasure to chair this key panel in the Policy Study Organization's 2022 Middle East Dialogue Conference. The panel is entitled Towards an Israeli-Palestinian Settlement, Making the Case for an Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian Confederation. In this first part of the session, Dr. Alon Ben-Meir, retired professor of international affairs at New York University Center for Global Affairs, will be presenting his paper with the same title as the panel. At 10 a.m. we will have 10 minutes of questions, after which the panel will take a short break and reconvene for the papers delivered by Hillel Schenker, who is co-editor of the Palestine-Israel Journal, Daniel Bar-Tal, Professor Emeritus at Tel Aviv University. And Alon Liel, former Israeli ambassador to South Africa, who will be joining us in the second part. Now, Dr. Ben-Meir has published a version of the paper that he's presenting today in World Affairs Journal, in the March issue of World Affairs, which is free access, as is related articles on the Middle East in World Affairs. And Daniel, I believe, has just posted the link in the chat for anyone who's interested in taking a look at the published versions of these articles. Professor Alon Ben-Meir is an expert on Middle East and West Balkan affairs, international negotiations and conflict resolution. For the last 2 decades, he has been directly involved in various back-channel negotiations involving Israel and its neighboring countries and Turkey. Professor Ben-Meir is featured on several TV networks and regularly briefs at the US State Department. And he's also authored 7 books on the Middle East. So it's with great pleasure that I hand the floor over to Professor Alon Ben-Meir.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm really very grateful to you. I want to thank you specifically also because of one of the first who have seen my essay on this subject, and receiving your compliments is a high honor for me. I'm also very, very grateful to Paul Rich. I don't know if Paul Rich is here listening to me. Paul, you're a very special person for me. Amazing, you've been helpful, supportive all these years. I will remain forever grateful to you. I also want to thank Danny Gutierrez. Danny, you're special, a special friend. You're amazing in the work you do, and the level of cooperation you and I have had over the years, I will not forget. And thank you again for chairing this session, meeting with us, being with us. And I always will look forward to future events conducting with you. But I do not remiss in mentioning I have 2 right arms assistants. One is Kim, and the other one is Arbana. I'm grateful to both of them for having beside me for all these years and being very encouraging with the work I do. You know, the subject matter today has been with me for, I hate to admit it, at least 40 years. From the time I graduated, as a matter of fact, my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, was on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was subsequently published as a book entitled Imperative and Choices. These imperative and choices have guided me all these years. And although there were so many changes on the ground over these 4 decades, to me, the one principal issue that remained constant, that in order to achieve peace between Israel and the Palestinians, the creation of a Palestinian independent state must be part and parcel of any solution to the conflict between the 2 countries. That is the only thing that remained constant. My approach, to the conflict at this point, having seen these changes on the ground, whereas the principle of establishing Palestinian state remained constant, we have now to consider what has changed on the ground and what brought me to believe that such a state will have now to be in the context, it be established in the context of Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian Confederation. And why is that? Now we have to survey what happened in the area. And I want to begin first and give you a sort of overall view of the reality on the ground in terms of demographics. Just think in those terms. In the West Bank, there are nearly 3 million Palestinians and close to 750,000 Israeli Jews. In Jerusalem, there are nearly 450 Israelis and about 300,000 Palestinians. In Israel itself, there are nearly 2 million Palestinians among nearly 6.5, 7 Israeli Jews. That is, and of course, Gaza, albeit does not have Jewish community, but it is in a location, geographically speaking, where at any future peace agreement between the Israeli and the Palestinian, Hamas, that is Gaza, will eventually have to be part and parcel of such a process, even though it may be even as an independent state for that matter. What I am suggesting here is that the interdisbursement, the disbursement between the Israelis and Jews will remain constant. That is, those who suggest that there are some Palestinian leaders and others who suggest that the settlement, Jewish communities will not be accepted to remain permanently in the Palestinian territory, is simply are not understanding or do not see the reality, which in this particular case is no longer shakable. That is, whereas maybe 70,000, 80,000 settlers may be relocated to a different settlement along the Israeli 1967 border, Jewish community in the West Bank will remain there under any circumstances. So the case is in Jerusalem. The Jewish community there, as well as the Palestinians, have been together for all of these years and will remain so under any circumstances. And of course, the situation among the Israeli-Palestinian situation in Gaza. That is, this reality itself, that is the interspersement of the Israelis and Palestinians, is a matter of fact. And I do not see how, under any circumstances, that this fact can be modified or changed in any extensive way. That is, in order for us to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have to carefully consider this reality and develop a framework that must be consistent with that reality. The second point I want to mention is the national security. Here, if anyone who surveyed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since 1967 can tell you unequivocally that Israel's national security has been and will continue to be central in Israeli thinking when it comes to a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And as a matter of fact, over the years, regardless of the enmity between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel and the Palestinians, specifically in the West Bank, developed close security collaboration. And that is because Israel felt strongly, and so the Palestinians understood in the West Bank, that if there is no security collaboration between the two sides, that area will continue to be destabilized seriously by various elements, extremist elements, both Israelis as well as the Palestinians for that matter. That is, whereas security then is central and the collaboration between the two sides must remain constant. There are those Israelis who say that we cannot leave the West Bank under any circumstances, because if we do so, the Palestinians will do just exactly what Hamas has been doing in Gaza. And I fundamentally disagree with that premise. But my answer to that issue is that whereas Israel left Gaza without any coordination between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority at the time, that is security coordination, it was almost a given that the area, that Gaza, will remain unstable and will constitute limited or sometimes extensive threat to Israel. So when we talk about security, we have to understand something very clearly, that no peace, and I repeat that, no peace can be established between Israel and the Palestinians unless there is significant security collaboration between Israel and the Palestinians at all times. And that is, no Israeli can make the argument that once we leave the territories in the West Bank, we will end up being subjected to missiles and rockets against Israel, splitting Israel into half. And my answer to that is not going to be the case, because you cannot withdraw Israeli forces nor the settlement unless there is comprehensive Israeli-Palestinian collaboration on all security matters. And as a matter of fact, in my speaking with Israelis as well as Palestinians, those involved in all security matters are very clear. That is what they want, and that is the objective will be. And as a matter of fact, as we speak today, this security collaboration is in place and will continue to be in place under any circumstances. The next point I want to mention is the settlement. Now, again, many Palestinians suggest that the West Bank is a Palestinian territory, and we will not accept the presence of Israeli settlements. And I can tell you in this regard that over the years, in various negotiations that took place going back to 2000 at Camp David, in 2009 and 8, and 2013 and 14, it was a clear understanding by the Palestinians that the major settlements along the Israeli borders, along with Ariel, which is some 11, 12 kilometers inside the West Bank, and many other settlements, will remain in place. And the Palestinians understood that and accepted that, The difference, however, the conflict between the two sides over the presence of these settlement is what the extent to which some kind of land swap will have to take place. That is, Israel will have to provide territory equal in size and in quality to the Palestinian to compensate for the territories that is being occupied by the Palestinians. That is, mind you, is being accepted by the Palestinian. And as I said, the only conflict remains is the percentage of the land swap that has to take place between the two sides. So that, again, it's a reality that cannot be changed, and that has to be very much included in any consideration for a future settlement between the two sides. The third issue, which is absolutely critical, is that the future of Jerusalem. And let's look at Jerusalem. As I said earlier, Jerusalem has significant Palestinian presence, that is nearly 300,000, and it has very significant Israeli Jewish presence as well. This Jerusalem is unique in many, many respects, historically speaking, religiously speaking, and its reality today. As a matter of fact, when I wrote extensively in the 80s and the 90s about Jerusalem, I always said Jerusalem will eventually become the microcosm of Israeli-Palestinian peace. Because when in the 80s and the 90s, when you went to Jerusalem, you saw the level of collaboration and cooperation between the two sides. You couldn't tell, as a matter of fact, who is an Israeli and who's a Palestinian in many cases. So that reality cannot change on the one hand. The other hand is the holy places. No one, and I repeat, no one can contemplate for a second that the holy shrines, the Muslim holy shrine, the Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock, and Israeli, the Wailing Wall, from the remnant of the Second Temple. No one can contemplate to change that under any circumstances. This is another stone on the ground that cannot be removed, which means the collaboration on all these the security religious matters has been and will continue to be for as long as the eye can see. In this respect, I want to have to add the dimension of the Jordanian position in this regard. The Hashemite kingdom has been the custodian of the Muslim holy shrine in Jerusalem from day one. That is going back to 67. And that is, Jordan will remain integral part of any solution to Jerusalem. And my view of Jerusalem is to remain united city in every respect. Electrical grid, highways, and in every other way would remain one entity. Now, the difference, however, will be the kind of political border. No border, no walls can be established back in Jerusalem. Merely a political border that delineate between Israeli capital, West Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem, which my view will eventually have to become the Palestinian capital. But since the two parts of the city are so integrated and so united, there have to be some kind of an arrangement between the two sides, whereas certain conflicts may arise between the east and the west of the city will have to be settled. And to that end, I'm suggesting the establishment of a certain commission of Israelis and the Palestinians that would deal with such occasional issue that may arise between the two sides. For example, crime may happen in East Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem by a Palestinian and vice versa, and they escape to the other side of the city. To what level they have to be collaborate in order to make sure that matters such as these and many others are peacefully resolved between the two parts of the city. So the city future, as a matter of fact, when we look at it today, I don't see any significant change, and should not be any significant change on the ground. The Israelis and the Palestinians will go back and forth to the both sides of the city uninterrupted with no constraint. And hence, that is how Jerusalem is today and how Jerusalem is going to be in the future. So those who say, under no circumstance will Israel give up East Jerusalem to become an Israeli Palestinian capital, I think they miss one important point. When I speak and I talk over the years, many times with officials from the Arab countries, certainly the Palestinians, if there is one thing they all agree upon, unanimously, is Jerusalem will have to be the capital of a Palestinian state. And as a matter of fact, when Israel established normalized relations with the United Arab Emirates, with the Bahrain, with Morocco, it was very clearly made that Israel cannot and should not annex any further Palestinian territories, and it will have to consider the fact that any future peace agreements between Israel and other Arab countries is going to have to be based on the fact that East Jerusalem must become the capital of a Palestinian state to preserve, from their perspective, their holy shrine in that city, but maintain, as I said earlier, the full collaboration between the two sides. So Jerusalem, to be sure, will become still the microcosm of Israeli peace agreement. And that is something that is going to be, in fact, helpful against what many Israelis fear, that Jerusalem can be the biggest obstacle between the two sides. I feel that Jerusalem can be, in fact, the bridge that make it possible to achieve peace between Israelis and the Palestinians. The fourth point I want to mention is the Palestinian refugees. This has been a tragic, painful situation for millions of Palestinians over the years. And that problem needs to be resolved. And when you look at it again, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the practical solution? I emphasize the word practical solution, not some illusions about what can we do with the Palestinians. There are many Arabs, Muslims, who feel that the Palestinian refugees should go back to where they came from in areas which is currently Israel. And I say that unequivocally, this is no longer possible under any circumstances, period. That is, Israel may accept 20, 30,000 Palestinians under family reunification, but there will be no en masse return to Israel under any circumstances, because that will instantly, I repeat instantly, will change the Jewish character of the state, and that is not going to happen. So what is then the solution? I advocated for many years. As a matter of fact, I made a very presentation to the British Parliament, to the EU, on issue. They asked me, what do you see happening there? And I'm going back, as a matter of fact, 10, 15 years, maybe 15 years, and I have not changed my mind on this particular issue one iota, and that is the future of the Palestinian is to compensation and or resettlement. And that is, if there is going to be, and there will be, a Palestinian state, those Palestinians who opt to go back to their homeland, they can still go to their homeland, which is the West Bank and Gaza. This is part of Greater Palestine. That is, if they are fully compensated and they can actually go back, find jobs, homes, they will definitely be able to go there, provided the funding is available. But as a matter of fact, when I spoke to the EU at the time, the purpose at the time, I said, we need, if we raise, at the time I mentioned the number $5-6 billion for this particular purpose, we will begin a process of resettling the Palestinians because there is no other solution. And as long as we continue to leave it the way it is, it's going to be further aggravated, further complicated, and the pain and the agony and the displacement of the Palestinian will only continue, and that is totally unacceptable from my perspective. But there's another point I want to mention. There are nearly 2 million considered refugees who are in fact in the West Bank and in Gaza. As I see, they are not refugees, they are internally displaced Palestinians. So again, we have to consider that. So if we're going to begin solving the Palestinian problem, let us begin giving them an opportunity to begin with in their places of residence currently today. But those who are in exile, that is, those who are living in Jordan, living in Syria, in Lebanon, and scattered elsewhere in the Middle East, and some of them even in Europe, should just choose to go back. That is under the condition of, that is, we'll have to meet the requirement of compensation and resettlement. Incidentally, I want to remind the listeners here that some surveys has been taken over the years among those who are outside the Palestinian, outside the West Bank and Gaza. How many would, in fact, would return if given the opportunity and the means by which they can sustain themselves? And nearly only 10-15% said they would go back because they've already settled in their current places of residence in various countries. And for them, there is no enough compelling reason to go back because now they have families there, they have work there, job there. And so many of them would seek some kind of compensation rather than resettle in the West Bank and or Gaza. The other point I want to mention is the Palestinian refugees in Jordan. Jordan absorbed the vast majority of the Palestinian refugees at the time. Currently, when we look at the Jordanian population, it's nearly 50%, in fact, maybe even more than 50% of Palestinian or Palestinian descent. The vast majority are full-fledged Jordanian citizens. They do not want to go anywhere else. They are there. As a matter of fact, they are the basis of the Jordanian economy, for that matter. There are only 2 Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, and that has to be, of course, addressed. But again, the solution to the Palestinian refugees is, in fact, in front of us. We can see it. It has been the case for many, many years now, and it continues to be the case today. And all of these discussions over the right of return, however, we have to respect the right of return in principle. The right of return can be exercised under the current geographic condition that exists between Israel and the Palestinians. And so, solution is there, but we're going to have to be creative, determined, and be moved in that particular direction. The issue concern our the borders. Now, given what I have just said, how do you see what kind of borders are going to be having between Israel and a Palestine and the Palestinian state? And we look at the borders today. There, Israel over the years, for security reasons, built many walls separating various Jewish communities from the West Bank to Israel proper, feeling that these walls will prevent terrorists, Palestinian terrorists, from crossing the borders, coming to Israel, and causing major harms in the state of Israel. Now, some of these walls may have to remain for a while, but as I see in the future, once there is an agreement about the settlement, and once there is an agreement on the other issues that we have discussed, there will be no physical borders between the 2 sides. And I'll give this, roughly 5, 7, 8 years for them to achieve that point. That is, once a trust is developed, once the cooperation economically in every other field is developed, there will be no longer need for any kind of separation in Jerusalem itself, be that partial or complete. That is, eventually the line, the separation between the Palestinian capital and the Israeli capital is simply a political line, appears only on the map, no other ways, and it is secure. The border is secure, that is, between Israelis and the Palestinians. And there is another element there, that is the Jordan Valley. Jordan Valley is where is the neighbor is Jordan. And today, if we look at the relationship between Israel and Jordan, and I'll speak a little bit more in a moment about Jordan, why Jordan should be part of the Confederation, is that Jordan today collaborate fully, and I repeat the word, collaborate fully and extensively on all security matters when it comes to between the 2 countries. As a matter of fact, the relationship between Jordan and Israel is extremely extensive. They share intelligence. They have significant economic collaboration. They meet on a regular basis. Unfortunately, it is not made public on a regular basis, but I cannot begin to tell you the extent to which the collaboration between Israel and Jordan it is today and will continue to be for as far as the eye can see. And so when we speak about borders, and we speak about, which is very directly Israel connected to national security, we can see that as long as Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians fully collaborate on all security matters, the line, the borders can be drawn. Wherever the both sides eventually will agree, given there will be some kind of land swap, these borders will eventually be pretty much what we see today along the 1967 border line, again with some kind of land swap to take place. So there will be, from our perspective, any significant or major argument or conflict when eventually border will need to be established, because really you cannot change much in the current situation other than some level of land swap. Now, why Jordan must be part of the peace process? Now, if we look at the history of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, Jordan has always been part and parcel not of the conflict, not of the violence between the Israelis and Palestinians, but as an integral part because A, it shares significant border with Israel. It shares significant border with the West Bank, with the Palestinians. And this border extends from the north of Israel all the way to Eilat, to the south, where Aqaba is where Jordan has direct or indirect involvement between Israel and the Palestinians. That's a very important issue to keep in mind. The second issue, which I mentioned to you earlier, that is Jordan being the custodian of the holy Muslim shrine in Jerusalem. This is something that no one can, in fact, deny or change. There are some talks about Saudi Arabia should take over that, but that is simply not going to happen because there is no reason for that to change. The third element is the maintaining the current economic collaboration and security collaboration between Jordan and between the three elements. That is, today there is significant economic collaboration between all three sides. There is absolutely no reason to end that, to stop that. And that is, if we were to look in terms of peace in the future, we have to look at Jordan as much integral part of that peace process. But for us to be able to maintain it, to make sure that this triangle condition continue to exist, we're going to have to, in any future negotiation, to involve Jordan directly in the negotiation process, because Jordan has vested interest in any future solution between Israel and the Palestinians. But the Jordanians have one condition. They will not be joining any kind of confederation unless there is an independent Palestinian state. That is, they're not going to be having a confederation with Israel under the current circumstances. In this regard, I want to move to the point where some of those who advocate there is de facto a one-state solution. That is, the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will have to rest on a one-state solution. As a matter of fact, they use some of my argument to that effect. The interspersement of the Palestinian and all over, the level of security collaboration, etc., etc. My answer to that question, issue is that under no circumstances, I repeat that, under no circumstances will Israel become a one-state solution. That is, that both Israelis and Palestinians. And the reason is very simple. If you were to have, that is, if Israel is to remain a democracy, and this is the key word here, and allow the establishment a one state, and I'll go to the one-state solution. In fact, demographically speaking, the Palestinian community, even today, is almost equal in terms of numbers to the Jewish community in Israel. And so for the Israelis, for Israel, that was created precisely to provide a home, a refuge for the Jews, have been suffering for millennia, of course, culminating with the Holocaust. They wanted a place, they call it our own. Whether we agree with that premise or not, whether we agree with what's happening on the ground or not, this is something that no Israeli, extreme left to the extreme right, will agree, with the exception of some few who advocate that position. So because of that, because the fact of Israel will not allow that to happen, because if it did, it will basically lose the Jewish national identity of the state. And the Israelis simply do not want to change, cannot afford to change that, because this is the premise on which Israel was created in the first place, to create a state for the Jewish people to come to find refuge, to find safety, if they choose to do so. But however, for many Israelis who from the right of center today, when you talk to them, and they say, well, you know, there is a de facto one-state solution. Look, we have a state and the Palestinian living in the West Bank, but of course that is the occupation. That is, the one-state solution, the way it is today, so to speak, it is not viable. It will never be viable, because the Palestinians need to have independent Palestinian state, regardless of the length, the depth of the future collaboration between the two sides. So here, they have to keep in mind that the one-state solution must be ruled out. And if it's ruled out, and given the other conditions on the ground, we have to think in terms of what other possibilities exist that can make this possible. Again, maintaining the integrity, the independence and the integrity of all sides, Israel, the Palestinian and Jordan, continue the present and expanding the cooperation between all three entities. And to be able to do so, you're going to have to create a framework that could encompass all of these elements together, while, again, as I repeat that because it's very important, maintaining the integrity and the sovereignty of the three parts. And that is where we come with the concept of confederation between the three sides. And let me just to give you the definition of confederation, to make it clear, and that is confederation are defined as voluntary association. I emphasize with voluntary association of independent state. It's important to keep that voluntary association of independent state to secure some common purpose, and obviously they all have common purpose, agree to certain limitations on their freedom of action to establish some joint machinery of consultation or deliberation. And that is, whereas the sovereignty and integrity under the Confederation remain the same. Because of the elements I mentioned to you before, there's going to be a certain level of collaboration. And that is all there is to it. And that is why it is so important to keep that in mind. Now, those then, we move to the next point, and that will say, so what happened with Hamas and what happened in Gaza? And this is a situation which is unfortunate. I must say that, studying this situation for so many years, in fact, Israel itself was the conduit for the creation of Hamas to begin going back many, many years. That is, the idea at the time was split the Palestinians to create, divide and conquer, so to speak. Israel, as a matter of fact, provided assistance and help to the movement early on. And it did not expect this movement to grow to the extent it has and to take the extreme position that it has taken today. And this is what we are witnessing. Israel withdrew from the Gaza, as I said earlier, without any collaboration, but with the Palestinian Authority. Subsequently, in a short war of 7 days between the Palestinian Authority and Gaza and Hamas prevailed and now took over Gaza since 2007. That is what's happened. Now, Hamas publicly has and continue to deny Israel's right to exist. But I want to tell you something. In talking to them privately, they know very, very well that under no circumstances will they ever be able to prevail over Israel. Period. They understand Israel's reality, that they, or perhaps no other power in the region, perhaps even outside, can change that reality. But for them to settle with the Israelis, they're going to have to find a formula. And the formula they suggested, which Israel has so far rejected, is to start with a long-term ceasefire. And it's a long-term ceasefire between 15 to 20 years. Israeli sees that approach as, well, if we give them 15 years or 20 years of ceasefire, all they'll be doing, buying more weapons, more rockets, prepare themselves for the next round of fighting. And I said, no, if you're going to establish long-term ceasefire, then you're going to have to create the conditions whereby your concern, your fear will not come to pass. And that is entirely possible. Now, that's one problem that we have, of course, with Hamas, but it can be dealt with over time. The second one is the animosity, the conflict between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. They have not been seen eye to eye since Hamas took control of Gaza. And they continue to speak about unity government. I'm not prepared at this point to suggest to you that unity government is out of the question. But that may very well take time. But should not, if the Hamas does not join the peace process today, it does not mean that Israel should not continue the peace process with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Because for all intent and purposes, Israel has only strategic interest in as far as Gaza is concerned, matter of security. Israel does not want, I repeat, has no interest on going back and and control Gaza and inherit 2 million Palestinians will have to deal with, to try to provide. Israel has no interest in that. And so even if Hamas does not enter the negotiating process today, they can in fact join later. And I even entertain the notion they may want to develop their own entity at one point in time. But I feel over the years, they may eventually see eye to eye and join the Confederation along with the Palestinian Authority, along with the West Bank, which will become an independent state. Now, so this, those who suggest this is the biggest obstacle they're going to have to deal with, I think they do not see the real picture, because if we look at the status quo, it seems extremely difficult. But if Israel is to go for the ceasefire, long-term ceasefire, and build on it, just imagine, build on it. That is, during these years, not merely trying to stop Hamas from acquiring new weapons and training more soldiers, but in fact, extend the collaboration between the two sides, make it possible for Hamas to build Gaza, to establish the proper infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals, the highways, the roads, whatever is necessary, to become pretty much independent. In my view, they will have no reason, compelling reason, to challenge Israel again, knowing full well that Israel could come within 2-3 days, level just about everything they have built in 20 years. And I will cite to you one example. This is what happened as a matter of in 2000. Before 2000, Palestinian Authority were able to build and expand the West Bank in so many different ways, develop infrastructure, more cities, boroughs, etc. But because of the Second Intifada, Israel went back to the West Bank, destroyed much of the infrastructure that the Palestinians built over the years. And mind you, since 2000, there was no major challenge Palestinians to Israel from the West Bank, because they know one thing, that if they are going to threaten Israel from the West Bank, Israel will have the means, the capacity, the military prowess to be able to go back and basically take it over, or for that matter, destroy everything that they have done. So they are not interested in that. And this is a good example, and Hamas will not be any different regardless of their religious and or ideological orientation, because they understand Israel is a fact of life. Israel is a power. Is probably the most significant power in the Middle East, and as a matter of fact, to some extent, becoming even a global power to some extent because of its advancements, its technology, its prowess, and its outreach. So it's a fact. Therefore, to suggest that Hamas will be the obstacle, I do not subscribe to that notion. Now, I mentioned all of these to you, and people will say to me, well, wait a minute, look at what's happening today. There is tremendous hatred between the two sides. There is profound distrust between the two sides. How are you going to mitigate that? That is, can we in fact be able to sit down, as Israelis and Palestinians can sit down with the Jordanian and negotiate a peace agreement between them, given the current tense situation, the distrust that I mentioned, between the two sides, and the fact that they do not see eye to eye on many other issues. And my answer to that question is that you're going to need to establish a period of what I call process of reconciliation. But this process of reconciliation is a must under any circumstance. Let me begin with the premise. Let's say there is no objective. The ultimate objective is the establishment of a confederation. But even if there is no such an objective, it is good for both sides to continue to establish that level of cooperation on all levels, in every level. So process of reconciliation cannot be harmful under any circumstances. But in order for us to achieve our objective, we need to have that process as long as we establish on the onset that the ultimate objective is the creation of a confederation. And that is that the process leads to that. During this 5 to 7 years of reconciliation, they will mitigate the distrust between the two sides. They will expand the level of collaboration on all areas. They will build infrastructure. They will create now new conditions that make it possible for both sides to see much more eye to eye and be able to work, together in the future. What does that process of reconciliation entail? It's just two parts, one between government to government and the other one between people to people. And this is critically important to understand. If you ask a child, a Palestinian child today, about Israelis, they imagine a Jew with a machine gun. And when you ask an Israeli child, 10 years old, what do you think of the Palestinian? They think of a terrorist. That is a mindset that is the most poisonous mindset you can possibly imagine. That ought to change. And ought to change if the government, to begin with, understand that the change is central, whether there is confederation or not, whether there is the state or not. That poisonous relationship must be changed because they are living together. They are interspersed. They are together. There is no way of separating them. So this process, then, we have to create a new atmosphere. For example, when I mention government to government, schools, textbooks ought to be modified to reflect the truth about the history of what happened in the last 50, 70 years, 73 years since Israel was created, even go back beyond that as well. You have to create other relate between the government, as I mentioned before, security collaboration between the two sides. Public narrative. It is critical to change the acrimonious public narrative so that the people in Israel and the Palestinians begin to understand they are not born to be enemies. They, in fact, born to be together because they are already together. And they cannot change that. So the government to government must begin that kind of a process to begin to modify, to change the mindset of the Israelis and the Palestinians toward understanding one another. Just imagine, hardly any Palestinian were able to go from the West Bank, go to Tel Aviv. And they don't see even how the Israelis live in these major cities in Israel itself. Imagine if women or students from various universities go to Israel and see and intermingle with the Israelis. That will make a huge difference. They can see each other. That's a human being. I have been in many settings where I put Israelis and Palestinians together. And initially they sit apart. But after we talk, and I ask, get together. I did this within the EU framework. I did this within the State Department framework. And once they start talking to one another, they then understand the mutual humanity they share, the mutual interests they share, the future they hope to realize. They have so much more in common than the differences that separate. They understand that. And I see them, adults, crying with real tears when they realize that they are human beings. All they want to do is live in peace and prosper together. Process of reconciliation is then central, people to people, sport activities between the two sides, visitation between the two sides, discussion between the academic community, discussions between the religious community on both sides. Having all this interrelation, intermingling between the two sides on a regular basis is going to create the condition very much conducive to moving toward the establishment of an entity whereby this kind of collaboration, cooperation, and intermingling between the two sides continues. So process of reconciliation is a must, and that has to be the foundation on which we have to begin in order to achieve our ultimate objective of confederation. I'm coming close to my time, but I need to mention 4 other important factors, albeit very brief. Even if there were to be very strong desire today by both sides to do that, to reach that kind of an agreement, it will be extremely difficult on their own. They need the support of other outside powers. The United States has and continues to play a significant role in that regard. Over the years, the United States convened many conferences between the sides in an effort to achieve peace between the two sides. The United States remains significant power, significant entity that can help mediating, that can help in terms of financing, can help in many ways in terms of security arrangement. So United States continuing role as directly and indirectly as mediating between the two sides remain essential. The second very important country that needs to be involved, and that's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia today collaborates with Israel on so many different levels. It is not made public, but I can tell you, they collaborate so much so, the only thing short of it is complete normalization of relationship between the two sides. But Saudi Arabia does not want to formally normalize the relation between it and Israel, is because the continuing conflict with the Palestinians. And I spoke to the Saudis time and again, and they feel once Israel and the Palestinians reach an agreement, we will go back to the foundation of the Arab Peace Initiative. Just about every Arab country and Muslim country will recognize Israel and normalize the relationship with Israel. And that is something that Saudis have in position that they have held to and will continue to hold on to. And that is, however, their role, therefore, is very significant. They have significant influence over the Palestinians. They need to be backing the Palestinians in these negotiations, and they hold the key to future normalization between Israel and the rest of the Arab countries, and the Muslim states for that matter, with the exception of a few of Muslim countries, such as Iran, possibly, and some other 1 or 2 other Muslim countries. So the third party is Germany. People ask me, why Germany all of a sudden? Well, Germany, as a matter of fact, has unique relationship between both Israel and the Palestinians. Of all the European countries, Germany is second only to the United States in its commitment to Israel national security. And that is going back, of course, historically speaking, the Germans feel that they have that obligation, and they have supported Israel in every which way throughout this process, throughout the conflict. And so Israel trusts Germany to be an important player. But Germany, at the same time, maintained very good relationship with the Palestinians. Many surveys have been taking place, and more than 50% of Palestinians feel Germany can be trusted, and much more than 60, 70% of Israelis trust the Germany to play a role. So Germany now can play a role again, since funding also is going to be necessary to settle the Palestinians, for infrastructure, for all that. Germany can also make significant financial contribution to this process. And the fourth country that must be involved in one form or another is Egypt. Egypt has been part and parcel of most of the negotiation ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Gaza borders Egypt. In fact, there is only outlet for Gaza, for the Hamas, through Egypt, and to cross to Israel in two different areas. But Egypt has been very much involved in this, in the concept, in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and has made supreme effort and continue to do so, moderating the situation, helping to calm the situation between the two sides, and its role has been and will continue to be indispensable in the future. Also, Egypt, in and of itself, is a significantly largest Arab country. It has played major roles in the past, and now it has to continue that role, specifically once there is an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. So Egypt is a major player, and we have to would be also involved in one form or another, directly and indirectly, in this peace process. And finally, let me conclude, albeit I leave much room for later on questions and answers, and that is, this has been a humanitarian crisis that has lasted now 73 years. And we have to ask ourselves a simple question: how much longer should both sides continue to suffer, when in fact the conflict become over time more intractable, more complicated, and more difficult? So we've been constantly making adjustments still to make this happen, to make peace happen between the two sides. But there's a point in time where there's extremists on both sides who could make the case. This is a hopeless situation. There will never be peace between the two sides. And many voices we're already hearing this. And I say the time has come. The time has come not to poison another generation of Israelis and Palestinians, but this is the greatest calamity, the greatest curse that you could impose on both sides. Poisoning another generation of Israelis and Palestinians. Instead of looking forward for the future, instead of looking forward, embracing each other, because they are in the same area, in the same place, another generation will be poisoned, another generation will see the other side as the ultimate enemy. That will have to stop, if for no other reason, but for a humanitarian reason. The time has come. And this is formula, in my view, can work, it should work, if there is only the goodwill made by both sides and the countries involved that can be helpful, focus on it and begin this kind of process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ben-Meir, for a wonderful talk on this. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, if you would like to focus on them. Before we begin on that, I would again encourage audience members to view Professor Ben-Meir's extended article for a proposal of an Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian Confederation on this subject that he spoke about today, which is published in World Affairs Journal. It's March 2022 issue. So it's just come out and it's for a limited time free access. The links to that are in the chat at the beginning. So, okay, Dr. Ben-Meir, we have a question from Jacob Smith here. How do you see the mood in the current Israeli administration in terms of looking for cooperation with the Palestinians?
The Bennett government, in fact, been trying to extend the level of cooperation between the two sides. This is on the economic level, on the security level, etc. But Bennett himself, the prime minister, is a hawkish, determined, would not allow the establishment of the Palestinian state, and he said so time and again. He is wrong, and I don't think he will be able to realize that is, prevent that from happening. So it was his predecessor, Prime Minister Netanyahu, held to them the same position. He said that under my watch, there will not be a Palestinian state. These are both sides, both of them come from the extreme right, and they don't necessarily represent the Israeli population as such. Although you might say Israel certainly is moving to the right of center. Many Israelis moving to the right of center. But the majority of Israelis, nevertheless, still want to end the conflict. And they come up with all kinds of ideas, be that one state, two state, but they want to see an end to the conflict. What we're trying now to provide is a formula it is, in my view, far more realistic to be able to achieve what Israel wants to achieve, what the Palestinians want to achieve, making, relatively speaking, minor concession to one another, given the reality in which they exist.
Okay. Okay, fantastic. Neil Patrick has asked a very involved and interesting question here concerning what would be the sovereignty and security arrangements in more eastward settlements like Kiryat Arba, or in terms of Israeli military installations in the Jordan Valley. And he goes on to say, sorry, assuming a West Bank Palestinian state would be largely demilitarized, what guarantees would there be for its security given potential Israeli sovereignty questions and or the protection of citizens inside the territory of a Palestinian state?
Yes, it's a very important question. First of all, I have been and continue to advocate any Palestinian state must be demilitarized, albeit they need internal security that will cooperate with Israel in order to deal with any violence that may erupt occasionally here and there. So demilitarization. How is it guaranteed? By virtue of the agreement between the two sides and by virtue of their continuing elaborative security collaboration. Israel is a present. Israel can see. Israel can tell without even being there what is happening in the West Bank, given its extremely sophisticated intelligence. So there's absolutely no reason to fear that even the Palestinians may agree to become demilitarized state, they will actually cheat and develop a military. You cannot hide that under any circumstances. No, as a matter of fact, when I speak with them, are interested in having a military. They need billions of dollars to have any military for that matter. They don't have the money, they don't have the interest. That's not going to happen. In terms of citizens, in my proposal, I established two things: citizenship versus permanent residency. And that is, many Israelis who are going to continue to live in the West Bank, they will continue to be, for that matter, Israeli citizens, vote or be elected in Israel if they choose to. But they need only to adhere to the local laws. That is the community law. That's what they need to adhere to. So they'll be permanent resident of that area, but can choose to remain Israeli citizens. Those who choose to change their citizenship, they're free to do so. I suspect that's going to be quite limited number of them. But then nothing needs to change. They are permanent residents in that area. What they own is theirs. Just like a permanent resident, a foreigner come to any country and buy a piece of land and they own it, for that matter. But they don't necessarily have citizenship. And as far as the Jordan Valley is concerned, it's been always a contentious area. But the truth of the matter is, it's the solution under the Confederation is rather, I hate the word simple, but it's really not that complicated. Because what you need is a Jordanian, Israeli, and Palestinian security arrangement along the Jordan Valley. That happens, it can happen. As a matter of fact, Israel and Jordan fully collaborate today. They continue with that, and the Palestinians can join that process just the same. And if necessary, should there be a fourth party from the outside, that is American presence for that matter, that is also possible. But the security over the Jordan Valley should not be and will not be a major obstacle to reaching an agreement between the three sides. I hope I answered all three parts of the question.
For members of the audience, if you'd like to pose more questions, we still have 5 minutes left, or to comment on some of the answers that Professor Ben-Meir has just given. Please go ahead and type them in the Q&A section. We can see them here. One of the things, Alon, that I remember in terms of your article, which I thought was very interesting, concerned the sort of social measures you mentioned, which you haven't had time to go into today, of course. The article is extremely detailed and very, very focused on policy proposals, particularly in terms of the individual supporting countries you mentioned, the US, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. And one of the things that I would perhaps like you to elaborate on, if we have a little time now, is you talked about these social measures that you were talking about in terms of education, which I thought was very insightful. And I wondered if you'd like to elaborate a little on that right now.
Very briefly, as only we have a couple of minutes left. Education is central. That is, it's a shape mindset. It's shape mindset. So it is so important when a child goes to school at the age of 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. He's been told the truth, the reality. Israel is there to exist. Not that there is no Israel. When geography books in Palestinian school do not show Israel, they show Palestine, as if it were still one single entity. Well, what kind of impression a child would have? There's only Palestine. Israel does not exist. When they portray the history of what happened, not exactly the way it did, that's what the child believes. So making sure that in school, the children understand what happened. So it is not just a question of what's right or what's wrong. They need to identify what's right and what's wrong. But they also need to identify what's the reality today. And the reality today, the Jews and the Palestinians need not to be enemies, perpetual enemies. Israel does not need a perpetual enemy to exist. The Palestinians need the full collaboration and cooperation and working hand in hand with the Israelis. So you need to prepare this generation. You cannot afford to poison a third and fourth generation, looking at each other as enemies that the only way to deal with it is by killing each other, by destroying one another. Yeah. So that is not going to happen. And the schools can play very significant role in moderating mindset. Of course, along with the public narrative, but both sides need to be making sure that the public hear the truth, that the public should not convey to the public that they are enemies, but they are potential good friends, good neighbors. And that's what the generation, that's what ought to be conveyed.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to pass the floor to somebody in the audience who is going to pose a question, I think, over the mic. So Daniel, could you facilitate that?
Yes, that's Mr. William Morris from the Next Century Foundation. William, I think you can speak now.
Okay, thanks. I'm not sure you can see me, but anyway, you can hear me. I was just curious about the way you were talking about East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinians. I mean, there are many Palestinians who would think of all of Al-Quds as their capital, and symbolically, and I don't see any problem with that. I think we have to accommodate that. The idea that Palestine has a capital in Al-Quds and Jerusalem, and it's also the capital of Israel. It has to be treated that way. The reality, of course, is that Palestine will control East Jerusalem if we have a settlement, and Israel, West Jerusalem. The only little minor thing that jarred for me was when you were describing Palestinian refugees as IDPs, and I just feel it's kind of disingenuous, because I mean, I know your intention, but if you've moved from, I don't know, Jaffa to the West Bank, then you're scarcely an IDP, you are a refugee. And I think the right of return to is made into more of a problem than is necessary, because Palestinians now will have the right of return to the new Palestinian state, and Israelis, the chances of dealing with that any other way are difficult. But I just wanted to make those two minor points. Sorry.
No, I agree with your first point in terms of Jerusalem. It remains the way it is. Israelis can go in and out East Jerusalem as they wish. The Palestinians can go in and out to the west between the East and West as they wish. And so that is make it much easier to swallow the idea that the Palestinians can have their capital in East Jerusalem. On the ground, really not much will change, because there is just another municipality there. But when I spoke about Palestine, internally displaced, I'm not making it light. That is, they are already in the West Bank. They are already in Gaza. I'm talking about these groups. I'm not talking about Israelis living in Israel, Palestinians living in Israel. They should be staying in place. This is their right. This is their country. But those who are in the West Bank and Gaza, who are considered refugees today, ought to be resettled or to be compensated in order for them to live a human, decent life. That's what I'm suggesting. And those Palestinian refugees outside the West Bank and Gaza ought to be provided with the means, should they decide to relocate to the West Bank, to their own country, that is entirely possible, or they want to stay in their country as a residence today, ought to be compensated. So we are not trying to change anything other than making it possible to resolve the refugee problem because of what exists today on the ground, rather than relocating. Like for a Palestinian living in Israel, there is a full Israeli citizen. They're not going to go from Jaffa to the West Bank. That is not what's required. They should be staying in Israel because they are Israeli citizens, and Israel should as it has. Of course, I hate to say this, discrimination against the Palestinian in Israel to some extent. There is, but that ought to change. There should no reason for it, but that's a different subject for a different time.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to William there, and very much thank you to Professor Alon Ben-Meir for this excellent first talk in this series. We're going to break now for about 10 minutes and reconvene with Hillel Schenker, co-editor of the Palestine-Israeli Journal, Daniel Bar-Tal, Professor Emeritus at Tel Aviv University, and Alon Liel, former Israeli ambassador to South Africa. But thank you very much to Professor Ben-Meir for a fantastic beginning to this panel. And Daniel Gutierrez will be chairing the second session after our break. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm very, very grateful to you. Thank you.